Leith Van Anselen, founder of Macro Business. I called you this morning asking you to jump online with me and do a recording about the federal election, what a monumental election that we've just had. Absolute wipeout by the Labour government, who I think have the most explosive housing policies we've seen for quite some time. And that's going to be the basis of our discussion today. Because as I talk about in my publication, when we look at land really is the economy. I mean, everything that we do is choreographed around the land market, particularly in a country like Australia, where we encourage speculation in land. And all I can see from a government that has now introduced 5% deposit scheme for all first home buyers without needing to pay LMI insurance, plus all of the other policies which we're going to dig into today, which are also going to add to the amount that they can potentially borrow. We've got a potential explosion in land prices ahead of us. And I don't think you need to be a fantastic economist in order to assess that. I think what perhaps is the most mind-blowing part of this election is that in an era where everybody is arguing about the cost of living, and the cost of living was apparently supposed to be the most informed element of this election, we have a Labour government that's going to come in and produce an absolute inflationary bomb underneath the land market with record immigration. When land prices become more expensive, those ongoing costs to everybody needing to pay higher prices for land, higher rents for land. Land is the basis of everything that we do. This cost push inflation into the economy now is what we are facing. And that is the subject of our conversation today. So welcome, Leith. I'm curious to understand what your views were from the federal election and how you viewed the result. Is this something that you expected to see happen?
Certainly not to the extent that we got. I certainly expected Labor to win. That was pretty obvious in all the polling that was done in the last sort of month before the election. Labor was well ahead on a two-party basis, so the result wasn't unexpected there. Certainly, the strength of the result was unexpected, and also the utter, well, I shouldn't say decimation, but the Australian Greens lost at least 3 seats out of their 4 lower house seats, and they could lose all 4. And they lost, outspoken housing spokesman Max Chandler Mather, as well as their leader Adam Bandt. They've still obviously got heaps of senators and that sort of thing. But I think that was also one of the unexpected results, because the Greens had run on a policy of banning negative gearing, effectively banning capital gains tax concessions effectively for housing, as well as rental freezes and all this other stuff, which let's be honest, most of that stuff wouldn't have come in. But if there was, say, a Labor minority government, we might have gotten negative gearing reform, as part of the deal, or curbing capital gains taxes, etc. But the fact that the Greens got in the lower house at least, they got decimated, means that those reforms are less likely now. So, certainly the election result was a green light for higher house prices, and also arguably a green light for more the rental prices rolling on as well.
What's interesting about the Greens, Leith, is that I don't know what it was like around where you were in terms of the Greens campaigning. I sit in the seat of Macnamara, which was a highly contested seat. It became an election where the population here were actually quite a large percentage of the population in my seat are Jewish. And all they saw was the Greens running on an election campaign that headlined Sanction Israel, with Greens outside the polling booths that were the most that they could say about the atrocities that happened on October 7th in regard to Hamas, who I think all of us would agree was absolutely a horrific event, was that it was regrettable. And it was quite startling to see the Greens change from what they were originally, which was about climate change, about this assisting people, like you say, with negative gearing and championing perhaps the renters that can't afford to get onto the housing market, suddenly run on this. And I think that was probably one of the reasons, certainly in my area, why they lost their seat, really. I mean, the conversation in my seat was around how do we ensure that the Greens come last, and therefore even people that wanted the Libs to come first were voting for the Josh Burns, who was representative of Labour, to ensure that he didn't come third, and therefore that the Greens would get a preference in order to perhaps come first in the seat. So
Yeah.
it was, I think that probably had something to do with it. It was really quite startling to see that. I don't know what your opinion is of that. It's obviously
Yeah.
controversial.
No, I think you're spot on, and let's be real here. Good riddance. I personally cannot stand the Greens. I used to respect the Greens back in the '90s when they actually were an environmental party,
Mm.
and they actually weren't as loopy as they are now. So back in the '90s, they were all about having a stable population. So they were against this very high immigration that Australia's got back in the '90s because they recognised that it was detrimental to the natural environment. So under Bob Brown, they were a lot more sensible back in the '90s. But
Mm.
then they switched in the late '90s once Pauline Hanson came around and became an open borders party. So they suddenly went from wanting Australia's population to stabilise and remain stable for the sake of the environment to outright, well, over gradually over a couple of decades becoming a party of open borders. Their official immigration policy is for more and more immigration, to basically have virtually unlimited humanitarian immigration, partner visas, grandparent visas, all this sort of stuff. And it's completely, opposite of their stance on the rental market. So the Greens tend to care about the rental market, yet they want open borders immigration, which is obviously terrible for rents because you're constantly growing the population and housing demand faster than you can build homes, which is one of the reasons why we've got the rental crisis.
Mm.
So they are no longer a environmental party; they're the opposite. They sort of uh, do some crocodile tears around climate change, etc. But they're basically a crazy activist party now, and they're disgraceful on their behaviour on the Israel Hamas war has been pretty appalling in my view, and they obviously overlook all the other atrocities that happen on the other side. So yeah, I'm that's one of the positive election outcomes has been the Greens have been degraded.
That's exactly how I felt as well. When Adam Bant lost his seat yesterday was, it was quite a celebratory event around these regions. So I sympathise with your views there. But the thing is, I'm quite astounded that this hasn't received. I know it's received a lot of press, but I understand that Louis Christopher has commented on this. But we have a party that is pumping immigration. We've got the 5% deposit scheme. We've got the HEX debt removal from the assessment when you go and get a home loan. We also have the capital gains on super, if you've got over 3 million in your super account, which is going to shift money out of super, and then obviously part of that is going to go into the property market. And we have then on top of that state government policy, which in many states is eliminating stamp duty under a certain threshold and giving incentives to first home buyers. And this is just how high can prices go when these policies get implemented? And I think kind of feeding into that is the conversation that we had earlier, which I know obviously working in the land market, is that everybody is now pricing this in, because the inquiry that I get on the ground is that the market's about to turn. We've got interest rate potential. The futures is pricing in a series of rate cuts. That's going to cause inflation into the land market. And I think when we did our last broadcast, which I did with you and Cameron Murray, we discussed what I think I put forward the premise there, that if we see that type of inflation coming into the land market, then the next move on rates at some point would be to raise them to prevent that inflation in land prices. We can debate that if you like, but obviously there's a lot to unpack there. So do you want to just kind of like pile in on that analysis that I've just put forward?
Yeah, I think it's spot on. So I think we're facing a perfect storm for house prices, and a positive storm, I should say. So the financial markets, if you take their view, and but the major banks have got similar views, are tipping 4 rate cuts by the end of the year. So they're tipping an end of year cash rate of 3.1%, which is 4.1% currently. So that's 4.25%, 0.25% rate cuts by the end of this year. Now, obviously, that is going to increase demand for property, as it always does. And then, of course, we have the policies that you've just mentioned from Labor. So the 5% deposit scheme. So effectively, what that is, Labor's promised that all first home buyers, so whether you buy a new home, existing home, whatever, they basically got rid of the caps on the price of the properties you can buy. There are some caps, but they've set at very high levels. So they're not going to affect 95% of first home buyers. So what Labor said is that if you're a first home buyer from 1 January 2026, you'll be able to buy a home with a 5% deposit without any lender's mortgage insurance, and the taxpayer, i.e. the federal government, will guarantee 15% of your mortgage. So that's effectively a state-sponsored subprime mortgage scheme. And the obvious result from that is you're going to get a hell of a lot of extra demand from first home buyers. You're going to have bigger mortgages, increasing borrowing capacity. They're going to put less money down. They don't have to wait as long to get in the market. And that's just going to put a rocket under house prices, obviously. And then, on top of that, Labor also has instructed the financial regulators, which means the banks, effectively the lenders, to exclude HECS debts or student debts from loan serviceability criteria. And analysis from Compare the Market done a few months ago suggested that if you're someone on a $100,000 income, your borrowing capacity just from that policy alone is increased by 56,000. If you're on 120,000, it's increased by 95,000. So it's just another one of these marginal policies that's going to increase demand from first home buyers, but all this stuff adds up. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the proposed taxing unrealized gains on superannuation accounts above $3 million, that looks like it's going to get up, especially now Labor's got such a big majority. And once that comes in, well, it's just going to funnel more money away from super and into residential property. That's a logical consequence, which means we're going to have more demand there. And it's worth pointing out now that at the end of 2024, according to CoreLogic's latest housing affordability report, Australian property was already at a record high relative to incomes. It was at a record high. That the amount of income required to service a new mortgage was at a record high, although obviously with interest rate cuts, that'll come down a bit. But if prices go back up, it'll go back up again. The percentage of income required to rent the median priced home in Australia was at a record high. The Australian housing market was valued at $11.3 trillion. That's all homes across Australia. $11.3 trillion in April. Now that equates to exactly $1 million average value per dwelling in Australia. So we're not talking about just Sydney, Melbourne here. We're talking about, back of Dubbo or, some regional areas. That's every apartment, townhouse and house across this nation was valued at $1 million at the end of April. So it's already incredibly expensive. And Australia actually has one of the highest property values relative to our economy in the world. So our housing stock is valued at about 4.5 times our GDP, so our annual production. And that compares to 1.7 times in the US. And so Australians, and it compares to 3.8 times in the UK, they're also very high. Canada, it's about 2.5 times. So Australians are already massively invested in housing, more than just about every other country. And because of this combination of lower interest rates or interest rates falling, and these sort of demand side policies from government, just means that prices are just going to keep rising. And Louis Christopher from SQM Research predicted that next year, once Labor's policy comes in, he predicted that that house prices are going to rise by, I think it was between 8 and 15% after Labor's 5% deposit scheme comes in. Now, one thing we could see though, Catherine, is we mightn't see as big a pickup as you'd expect over the next 9 months. So assuming the Reserve Bank of Australia cuts interest rates by 0.25% later this month, which is what everyone expects, and then they follow up with 3 more rate cuts by the end of the year, you normally expect that to funnel straight into house prices and have, higher house prices. But we could see that, while I still think house prices go up, we mightn't see them go up as much as you'd expect by the end of the year, purely because a lot of first home buyers might delay their purchasing decisions until 1 January next year, when this 5% deposit rule comes in. And so if that's the case and we get some delays in purchases, we mightn't have as big a pickup as you'd expect this calendar year, but then next year, boom. So I think, the upshot here is that by the end of 2026, I'd expect house prices to be significantly higher than they are currently. And basically, all these factors, lower interest rates, these policies from the government, are a perfect storm for house prices, in my view.
I think it's worth mentioning, and I take your points on board, but there is already the 5% federal deposit scheme.
It is capped though, and I think it's capped both in number, but it's also capped in. So I think it's 40,000 a year. That policy, and also it's capped. That there's quite strict price caps on those, and from 1 January next year, it's going to be completely uncapped. And
That's certainly an important point, but I can tell you from experience of working with first home buyers that it's actually not difficult to access that. And the brokers have their ways of manipulating the system so that a buyer can get that. So, for example, it's favoured towards low-income buyers. And if you've got a lot of money in your bank and you're considered that you can afford a deposit substantially above 5%, then often what is negotiated by brokers that I know is that money is moved out of bank accounts, and so that you can prove that you show the bank account saying I've only got so much money in the bank, and with a little bit of manipulation, as we've seen so often when it comes to mortgage lending, people have been able to access that scheme. But I take your point on board, because just the very concept of it being packed is a discouragement, being capped, sorry, is a discouragement for buyers moving forward on that scheme. But the interesting thing is that the rental market is still extremely tight, and rents in desirable pockets of the city, and you and me are in Melbourne, and I look at this very closely in Melbourne because this is where I work, are still increasing. There's still a push on rents. There's still low availability on the market. We have the state government in Melbourne that are saying that below 600,000 you don't need to pay any stamp duty. So with schemes like this, where you can go and access a 5% deposit, in some cases you can actually buy on based on a 2% deposit if you meet those income requirements. And we've also got the shared equity schemes which are available. It is cheaper for a first home buyer to buy than it is to rent, and that's really where the economics of it become a no-brainer for first home buyers or renters that perhaps hadn't considered getting into the market, that it's now makes more sense for them to go out and buy. And unfortunately, when they buy based on policies like this, which are encouraging them to take on debt as to high leverage, at this point in the cycle that I analyze, as you know, then we're entering a situation where they're being led into a market that is about to be fueled by demand, and that type of demand only goes so far. Prices can only go so far before they have to fall back. That's the danger, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. So the danger is, and with these policies, doesn't matter if it's first home buyer grants. We've seen this since the turn of the century. These sorts of policies, that the result is always the same, right? So if you're a first mover and you're one of the first people who gets in, you're probably okay, because you get in before the prices then rocket. But take the example of my teenage kids. So I've got a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old who's about to turn 15. Now let's just assume in 10 years they're looking to buy a place, or at least one of them is. If this policy's been running for 10 years, all it's going to end up doing is these sorts of policies are going to be capitalized into house prices like they always are. And in 10 years' time, effectively, my children, if they use this 5% deposit scheme, they'll end up paying as a deposit, probably the same as what they would have paid under a 20% deposit scheme if this policy hadn't come in, because prices would be so much higher. Or actually, they probably wouldn't do quite as much. But the point is, they'll end up paying a lot more overall for housing than they would have if the policy hadn't come in, because prices have been bid up. And all it means is that they'll end up taking out a bigger mortgage to buy the same house at home anyway, and they'll be carrying more debt into their life. So, it's a self-defeating policy from a housing affordability perspective. Obviously, if you're one of the first movers who gets in the first few months of it, it's probably fine and you'll do okay. But if you go down the track, once the prices go up and the policies capitalize into house prices, buyers then they're actually worse off than they would have been otherwise, because they end up paying more, they have less equity in their house, and they carry bigger debts. Because in the end, this, anything you borrow under this policy, it still has to be repaid. And the banks will be happy to lend it to you because 15% of the mortgage is covered by taxpayers. So the banks are in a no-lose situation, really. Even if they have to sell it on you down the track and there's a housing correction, they'll probably get all their money back. It has to fall by more than 15% for them to even be at risk. But if you're a buyer, you're substantially worse off, because the debt will still have to be repaid. And all you've ended up doing is buying a home you would have bought anyway without the policy, but you paid more for it, and you end up carrying more debt. So it's self-defeating from a housing affordability perspective, and all these policies always are. And we've seen it for 25 years since, we've been running these sorts of policies for at least 25 years, with all first home buyer grants and, all this demand side stimulus, and it never makes housing more affordable. It just ends up bidding up house prices. And I think this time's going to be no different.
Yeah, of course. I also think that it's interesting that the lower end of the market for a lot of first home buyers are apartments. And, what we can expect to see is a lot of first home buyers going in and buying apartments, which are notoriously poor investments, particularly the newer built apartments that have got construction issues. And this is a story that we've covered many times. I don't need to rehash it in great detail, but, this is possibly the worst investment that you can buy when you're entering the housing market, particularly if you want to leverage up the mythological property ladder. And then you've got all the issues with ongoing strata fees and ongoing maintenance costs and levies. So, we really are walking in immature buyers into taking on a lot of debt and being tied down, particularly when they're not having their student debt assessed in that as well. And they've got that to deal with also. So, in some ways, we're impoverishing a lot of people into this. It's not so much getting them onto the housing ladder, but encourage them to step into the market at what I would assess would be the wrong time to step into the market, because I feel that we are facing the end of the land cycle economic downturn. Probably we've got about another year, maybe a little bit more to go before we start seeing the cracks in the economy that's going to take us into that land-based led recession. And that's where the people that were in last are the ones that are going to get caught out. It's important to mention immigration, because I think that everybody, you talk to anybody on the street, it's a very popular song, no matter where you live, whether you live in Europe, whether you live in America, whether you live here, regarding immigration being undesirable, because people recognize that it lowers their quality of living with the increased traffic on the road, and then also getting migrants that are coming in that really don't necessarily mix with the population. We've seen protests, for example, on the streets every week in Melbourne over recent times over the Middle East conflict and the ruptions that has caused in the social fabric of our nation, which were played out in this election, particularly by the Greens, as I mentioned. It's that immigration, which is now at record levels, is pouring into mainly the East Coast cities, Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney. So that's population growth going into areas of limited supply, into a housing market that's about to be fueled by probably a substantial increase in demand at the lower price points, which will cause a price multiplier effect across the remainder of the market, as people selling lower priced properties have more in order to leverage up. It astounds me that we're facing this situation, but you're the one that has really put the immigration numbers into great context for people to understand what is happening on the ground. I mean, who is it that's coming into the country, and how does it compare to what's happened historically?
Yeah, immigration is not currently at a record high, but it has been in the post-pandemic period. So before the pandemic, Australia, the highest year of immigration ever was about 310,000 in just around about the GFC under Rudd and Gillard, right? So we'd never seen numbers like that before. The 60-year post-war average in Australia, so from the 60 years after World War II, Australia's net overseas migration, so net migration, averaged 90,000 per year. And we only, in only 2 years out of that 60 years, did Australia exceed 150,000. We didn't exceed it by much, right? So that was the sort of steady state normal immigration into Australia for about 60 years. From the mid 2000s, the Howard government first, and then the subsequent governments ramped it up massively. So in the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, we averaged about 220,000 net overseas migration a year. So it went from 90,000 average for 60 years and only exceeding 150,000 in 2 calendar years out of that 60 to suddenly averaging 220,000 a year for the 15 years leading up to the pandemic. Obviously, we had the pandemic period where we had a couple of years of, basically zero net overseas migration for a couple of years. One of those years was actually negative. Then we had a massive rebound like we've never seen before, whereby in just two calendar years we got about 1 million net overseas migrants. It peaked at about 560,000 in one of the calendar years. Currently, we're tracking, as of the September quarter, 380,000 net overseas migration, which is still higher than anything we ever had pre-pandemic. And the latest monthly arrivals and departures figure from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is sort of like a proxy for net overseas migration. This data comes out every month. It's only a few months behind when it comes out, whereas the official quarterly stuff's always 6 months behind. But that the latest monthly data suggested immigration's rebounded again. So we got down to 380,000 up to the year to September, and then the first quarter of this year, according to that monthly data, it's gone back up again. And certainly, the reaction to the Albanese government being re-elected from migration agents, from international students, and from the Indian community was jubilant. They all see this as being fantastic for immigration from their perspective, i.e., we were going to get more immigration. So I think under Labor, they're going to maintain very high immigration. It was reported in the Australian Financial Review, I think it was, the Australian this week, that Labor wants to bolster the Indian Free Trade Agreement, which we've already offered we've already signed 3 agreements with them to boost immigration. They want to expand it even further with a renewed trade agreement. So expect more there. And the upshot is that this is coming at the same time as dwelling construction. So the housing construction rate in Australia is appalling. So it's tracking just above decade lows. So we're building, roughly just above decade lows in numbers of homes being built. So it has rebounded a little bit, but it's still incredibly poor. So dwelling completions are tracking, dwelling commencements. So those are homes that are under construction. The latest figures there show that we're commenced less than 170,000, so about 169,000 homes are currently under construction or have been, approved. Have commenced construction. And the Albanese government has set a annual target to build 240,000 homes per year, which is 20,000 a month, 60,000 a quarter, or 240,000 a year. So 1.2 million homes over 5 years. We're currently tracking about 30% below that. And so we've got this ongoing high immigration into a supply side that cannot build enough homes. The government set this artificial target of 1.2 million homes over 5 years, 240,000 homes a year. We're tracking about 30% below that. That target has zero chance of being met. It has zero chance because the cost of building housing has gone up about 40% since the pandemic. So we're talking everything from bricks, concrete, whatever. It's gone through the roof. So that's made it more expensive to build. Apartment developers can't make a profit with these current pricing. We've got labour shortages. We've got the state government's building heaps of infrastructure, which has sucked resources away from home building. And we've got record insolvencies amongst home builders. So a whole bunch of home builders have gone broke, which means we've got less capacity to actually build housing. So we've got this perfect storm for the rental market, which has already got vacancy rates near at historical lows, about, just over 1% nationally, which is appalling. And we've seen, 40 to 50% rental increases since the borders opened back up. So the renters are getting absolutely hammered. So we've got this situation whereby Australia has got a supply restricted market from those factors I've just mentioned. At the same time as the government, especially this Labor government, if you go by migration agents, the international student community, in the Indian community, uh, are going to maintain this very high immigration policy. So too much demand, can't build enough homes to supply that demand, can't build enough infrastructure, means one thing for the rental market. It means that we're going to have ongoing low vacancy rates, upward pressure on rents. Rents mightn't grow as much as you'd think, though, because we're seeing this big shift back into group housing. So, you know, the rental market's hit a kind of affordability ceiling whereby people are already spending a record share of their income on rents, the highest in history, and they can't afford to spend a lot more because renters tend to be lower income earners. So instead of spending more and bidding rents up even further, they're now starting to move into group accommodation. So we're seeing this big shift in the last year or so back into group accommodation, and you can expect that to just continue. So, you know, the government's going to keep importing hundreds of thousands of renters into the rental market every year from overseas. We're not going to build enough homes for those renters. Therefore, the vacancy rate's going to remain really tight. We're going to get higher rental inflation than we should, and as well as a increase in the average size of rental households because people will group up to save on costs, and we'll end up with bigger rental households effectively. So it's not a great picture if you're an Australian tenant because the federal government has just chosen through stupidity to continue to import hundreds of thousands of people into a supply restricted market, which is just making the lives of renters a lot worse. We're going to have more homelessness, more people living in insecure housing, more group housing, and more people in rental stress. That's the upshot of it.
The explosion in rooming houses. I think I've had more investors that have been looking to purchase rooming houses than I've had for quite a period of time over the last 12 months. Not the easiest homes to manage, got a high turnover in rooming houses, and the property management costs are pretty high, and the maintenance costs obviously are high. But those people that do it right are actually, making bigger profits than they've ever made because of the demand that's poured into there. And I think that, when we were discussing earlier, you were talking about how terrible the traffic is on the road. So obviously that's going to put a strain on infrastructure, which is then going to put pressure on governments to spend more on infrastructure which of course is going to further feed into land prices. I mean, it's a perfect storm for the real estate market, really, isn't it?
Well, can I just say something there, Catherine? So, one of the reasons why we have this hyper, it's obviously not the only reason, credit and all the other stuff and tax policy and whatever. But one of the reasons is that we have pressure in the rental market and the purchase market is because Australia's experienced the fastest population growth in the advanced world. So, Australia has grown its population by 46% since the turn of the century. So since 2000. Like Australia's grown its population. It was just under 19 million when the millennium was rung in back in first of January 2000, and it's currently we've had a population increase of 8.7 million people since then. That is enormous, and the official population projection from the Centre for Population, which is run out of the Australian Treasury, every year they release their annual population statement. The most recent one came out in December, so just before Christmas, and it predicted that Australia's population is going to grow by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. Now, everyone's going, "Oh, yeah, that's a big number." Well, I'll tell you just how big that number is. That is equivalent to add in. So if you imagine all the people in Sydney right now, all the people in Melbourne, and all the people in Brisbane, those three cities, 13.5 million is equivalent to add in another Sydney, another Melbourne, and another Brisbane. So all the people in those three cities, Australia is going to add, according to these projections, in just 40 years. Now that is just insane. So that obviously requires all the homes that we have in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane to be replicated in just 40 years. And of course, most of that growth is going to happen in those three cities. So it took Melbourne. It's taken Sydney. What is it? About 240 years to get to its current size of 5.5 million people. It's taken Melbourne, I'd say 100 190 years, 195 years to get to its current size. Brisbane, roughly the same as Melbourne. And we're supposed to grow those three cities again in just 40 years. And all the infrastructure that are in those three cities, all the homes that are in those three cities will need to be replicated effectively if we want to avoid living standards going backwards. And I just cannot see how it is possible from an engineering perspective, from a water perspective, from an energy perspective, from any sort of perspective to grow your population by Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane in just 40 years and not expect negative consequences. So that is the very, very long macro view for property. Obviously, that's a very, very, very long term. But the official policy of the federal government is to maintain this very high immigration policy that we've seen over the last 20 years for the next 40 years. So, you know, the average net overseas migration in the last 20 years has been about 225,000 a year. And it's projected to be 235,000 over the next 40 years. So the sorts of population growth we've seen over the last 20 years are going to be replicating over the next 40. So just imagine what's happened the last 20 and then double it, because that's 40 years. And, you know, we've all seen the consequences of it with traffic congestion, housing affordability, all this sort of stuff. That is the plan of the government, just to keep doing what we've done the last 20 years, but do it for the next 40 years. And again, I'll say it one more time, all the people and all the houses and all the infrastructure in Sydney, plus Melbourne, plus Brisbane, will be required in the next 40 years to avoid our living standards going backwards. And it's just not possible. And that's the stupidity of this Big Australia policy. It's just growth for growth's sake. And it's just going to make the housing shortage, if you want to call it that, a permanent feature of the economy, because we can never build enough housing. We can never build enough infrastructure. We haven't done it in the last 20 years. So what makes anyone believe that we're going to do it over the next 40 years under the official policy?
We are a centric population. And when you look obviously at the capital cities in Europe, you start to get an image of what we're heading towards, because, you know, if you look at London, Brussels, Paris, these are areas that are extremely built up. What we've got a situation now that if you're a family in Melbourne and you want to buy a home, you can go a little bit further out into one of the middle ring suburbs and perhaps get onto a house with a little bit of a piece of land and have a fairly good quality of lifestyle. However, Sydney, you know, how it is now is probably a little bit more of a representative of where we're heading, which is it's far more of a built up market. Sydney is a very centralized market because of its geographical landscape. I have a friend in Sydney at the moment that is paying $775 a week for a 1-bedroom under 50 square meter apartment. She's just decided to purchase the apartment that she wants to purchase is well over $1 million. And has actually had a pretty good consistent record of capital growth. But the levies that are on the strata fees are tremendous. The view that she's got isn't great. It's overlooking a car park. The facilities inside the apartment are pretty aged. And this is really, when you're saying, you know, the quality of life, that's the reality of it. You know, if you go into London, I mean, obviously I'm from England, you know, London isn't a nice city to live in. If you go into the centre of Melbourne, it's not where people want to raise a family and live. But that's what happens to these built up suburbs when you squash a population together and you force people to live in close quarters in apartments, which in Australia are very poorly constructed. There are some cities that construct apartments very well. Actually, I mentioned Israel has got some very well constructed apartments over there where you go into an apartment and it's a little bit like living in a home. You know, you've actually got a garden rather than a balcony, even if you're a little bit further up. But, you know, that's not the reality of what we're doing here. And I think that is the risk of where we're heading, that people feel very trapped in a outcome, which is not really what you want to bring your children up within. And you know, the premise of Land Cycle Investor really is to get people out of a financial trap and to you know, inform them to some extent as to where to put their investments and where to recognize these downturns that are coming in the economy, to give themselves choices to get out of not the rat so much the rat race, but to get out of the inner city areas so that they can have some kind of lifestyle, quality of lifestyle for, their family and their kids. But, we're heading into an era which also, with the technological advancement of AI and the shift that we saw over COVID, which has kind of given us a glimpse of where we're heading, to a remote workplace, to doing things remotely, to not meeting people, to learning remotely, to not necessarily even attending educational institutions, but perhaps doing that learning, online. It's something that is, in a sense, uncharted waters to where we've been. That progress is going so rapidly. It has to feed into land prices ultimately, because that's the way that they're encouraging the cities to be formed. They're funneling people into these areas which are restricted in supply, which of course just feeds into the land price and produces this explosive land cycle, which has a timing mechanism behind it. You can time it as to when those downturns are going to come.
Yeah, well, certainly there's no plans in Australia to decentralise. So, the projections are, if you live in Melbourne like you and I do, the official projection is for Melbourne to be 9 million people by 2056. Now, that's another 3.2 million people that's 3.5 million people in the next 32 years. So just to put that into perspective, it took Melbourne 170 years to get to 3.5 million people in roughly the year 2000. And we're going to add. So if anyone's from Melbourne and you've lived here and you're old enough to remember, just picture Melbourne in the year 2000, and just think that we're supposed to add that in the next 32 years to Melbourne currently. Like, these are absurd numbers here. Who the hell wants to live in Melbourne when it's 9 million people in just 32 years versus the Melbourne of 2000 when we were 3.5 million, and it was a far better place to live on every metric, like getting around, the cost of housing, the cost of everything was a lot better back then. The public transport was better because you didn't have as many people trying to use it, etc. So that's the plan. And for Sydney, if you're from Sydney, the Urban Task Force did an analysis, did projections. They're about 6-7 years, 5 years old, I think. So they are a bit dated, but before the pandemic, they came out and they said that at the 2016 census, which was the census they had data to at the time, about 57% of homes dwellings in Sydney were detached houses, and the rest were apartments and townhouses. And by 2057, the Urban Task Force projected that only 25% of dwellings in Sydney would be detached houses, 50% would be apartments, and 25% would be townhouses. So that there is complete transformation of Sydney from a majority detached houses with backyards, like not a big majority, but 57%, to only 1/4 of dwellings in Sydney being detached houses with backyards. Literally half the population living in apartments, with most of them high-rise shoeboxes, and then 1/4 in townhouses. So that is a massive transformation in a relatively short period of time. And again, it gets back to this high migration. If we keep growing the population, Sydney by then would be, pushing towards 8 million, wouldn't be quite there yet. But those people need to live somewhere. And obviously Sydney's built up, as you said. So they're going to be demolishing, detached homes and replacing them with townhouses or apartment blocks, etc. Melbourne, similar trends, but not as bad because we're not as landlocked. But Melbourne's composition of homes is also going to transform to a lot more high rises, etc. Obviously, we've already seen that. That's going to continue. And if Melbourne gets to 9 million people, we'll probably get to the stage where less than half the dwellings in Melbourne, are detached houses, and most are apartments, and then supplemented by townhouses. So this is a huge transformation in living standards and the fabric of Australia. That has happened in the last 20 years, and is projected to happen in the next 40 years as Melbourne adds 13.5 million. As Australia adds 13.5 million people. Again, another Sydney, another Melbourne, another Brisbane into Australia's population. Most of those in those three cities. It is mind-blowing stuff when you think about it.
Unfortunately, the advocacy that we do hasn't encouraged people to vote against those policies, because as we can see from the result from this election,
Yeah, but to be fair, no one's really given a choice. So all three parties are big Australia. It's just coalition was slightly not as big Australia, but they're all big Australia. The Greens are a complete. The Greens are for the biggest Australia, Labor's for the second biggest Australia, and Coalition for the third biggest Australia. But they're all big, and even if the Coalition had got in, we're not going to see much change in the migration. Maybe by 20, assuming they stayed in, the next 40 years, maybe Australia would get to 38 million people, not 42 million people, or something like that. It's still the same sort of process. It's going to happen. We don't really have a party that's a major party that's against this. It's for sustainable growth, for economic diversification, away from just houses and holes. But that is effectively the policy in Australia across the political spectrum. In fact, the Greens is just houses because they don't want any mining as well. So they just want us to become basically a third world nation where we don't sell anything to the world because we've got nothing to sell except for immigration. That's effectively the Greens policy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the only, and I know you're short on time, so we'll wrap this up in a minute. But I think the only thing that I do notice is the only city that's gone backwards in price over the last 12 months has been Melbourne, because Melbourne we had a treasurer which really did something that no one else has been successful doing in Australia, which was to start to shift more taxes onto land. And as unpopular as that policy has been, it has shifted land values in Melbourne. It's produced a downturn in the market. We've had a market that really hasn't gone anywhere, whereas if you want to buy land, you've been able to buy at prices in some instances that are as low as they were 5 years ago. It's wiped away the capital growth for a lot of people that we saw over the COVID boom in Melbourne. We've had a lot of investors selling, which has opened the market to first home buyers. We've had more first home buyers than any other state in Australia. And, it's a real casebook study, I think, for why, it's the study really of the trap that we're in, which is, you either buy into the mythological property ladder and leverage up and live the booms and the busts in the economy and the population growth that keeps that energy going into the land market, or we reverse those policies and we start to tax land and we start to, reduce taxes on productivity and capture those gains from the land market and deaden land prices, which is really how we create more affordability in the market. If you're spending less on land, you're borrowing less from the banks, which is reducing the mortgage debt. Because I don't know what our private debt levels are at the moment. I did look, I think end of 2024.
Yeah, it's about 180% of income. So Australia is at the very, very top of the world on that metric. Like we're not necessarily number one, but we're right up in the top. If you were going to say the top decile, we've been the top 10%. Certainly higher than the other English-speaking nations. And so we have oodles of debt. Our debt servicing ratio. So I actually pulled these numbers yesterday at the Bank for International Settlements. So that's your principal and interest debt repayments. So not just interest, but principal as well. Australia leads all the English-speaking nations there. I think Norway was actually above us by memory, but we're right at near the top of debt and debt repayments in the world. So and obviously when you get policies like the 5% deposit scheme and things like that, well, obviously that's going to lead to more household debt because people are going to be putting down lower down payments. They're going to have much higher capacity to pay because the government's guaranteeing part of their mortgage. They have to pay lenders' mortgage insurance, etc. Wiping off HEX debts to not actually Labor. I didn't even mention this. Labor's actually going to wipe off people's HEX debts as well, which will give them suddenly a lot more disposable income to buy property as well. So there's that as well, which I didn't even think about until now. So yeah, effectively Australia's already got super high debt compared to the rest of the world, and it's going to go higher based on the policies we've got.
That's actually why swung a lot of young voters off Greens was that, wipe away your HEX debt. It's a no-brainer to vote for Labor.
Yeah. And look, I mean, honestly, if I was in that boat and I had a, $60,000 HEX debt, I'd probably be like, yeah, let's go for it. I mean, you'd vote on self-interest. So, yeah, I mean, fair enough. But there's no desire amongst any of in Australian politics to wean Australia off its housing addiction.
Of course.
And we saw that, Labor's policies are a shocker. The coalitions were a shocker as well. So, we're not even worth talking about because they didn't get in. But, it would have been similar impacts, just different ingredients, but the similar taste in the end. So it's like, coalitions would have been Pepsi and Labor's is Coke. It's both bad for your health, both going to rot your teeth, and but both very addictive if you know, if you're hooked on the property crack.
They weren't quite as inflationary, I didn't think, as Labour, but you make a really good point there, and I was talking about it also with when in the lead up to the election, discussing with people that people vote on self-interest. So of course, when you increase the number of people that are stepping onto mortgage debt and buying property, then how successful do you think it's going to be for them to vote for policies that are going to take away that inflation in the land market? People enjoy the fact that once they've purchased a property, they're no longer for affordable housing. They're then for housing going up. As every prime minister that we've had has reiterated. I think for the last one was Tony Abbott, that said people like their property prices going up a bit, not a lot, but we like them going up.
Yeah, and both sides said that during the election. So, Claire O'Neill, the housing minister, said that, her policies for sustainable price growth. And then Dutton said the same thing. So, yeah, look, that's just the way Australia is. We've bet in this horse, and they're going to ride it for as long as they can ride it till the horse is broken. And every time it looks like the horse is going to break, they then slap on a band-aid and do another demand side policy and come up with a new way to suck more people in the market and push up debt and push up prices. And this election was no different.
Real estate agents rejoice, I think, was the outcome of this election. It's the one good thing. If you didn't like Labour, the real estate agents are rejoicing over what it's going to do to the property market and the commissions that they're going to get in return for it, which isn't going to, I'm sure, be popular with your audience. But thanks so much, Leith, for coming on, having a chat with me. Always appreciate your acute analysis of what's going on in the economics of Australia and beyond, I might add, because you do very good analysis on New Zealand as well. Your site is macrobusiness.com.au, and it's where everybody should go to get their to get the commentary that they're not going to get anywhere else. The commentary is absolutely fantastic, and obviously you work very hard on that each day. So thanks very much for joining me, and we will do it again.
No worries. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everyone.